Sure, take it away. Do I turn on my mic now? Or?
Sure, up to you. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this week. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ed Spevak for our seminar speaker this week. Dr. Spevak has dedicated the last 43 years of his career to the conservation of invertebrates and vertebrates, working at zoos and aquariums as a zoo curator and small population biologist. Ed is the curator of invertebrates at the St. Louis Zoo and is the director of St. Louis Zoo's Wild Care Institute Center for Native Pollinator Conservation. Ed and the St. Louis Zoo helped to establish the IUCN SSC Bumblebee Specialist Group, now called the Wild Bee Specialist Group. Ed and the zoo also helped establish the Honeybee Health Coalition, Farmers for Monarchs and Missourians for Monarchs Collaborative, and Ed serves on the steering committee of each. Ed is also a member of the Science Advisory Council of Field to Market, looking at biodiversity issues in the sustainable agriculture chain. Ed, through the Center for Native Pollinator Conservation, has developed a program called Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators, focused on food security, food sovereignty, and pollinator conservation with Native American reservations and communities. And we're thrilled to have him today. So with that, take it away.
Thank you very much, Matt. Glad to see a bunch of people here, on a dreary day, at the end of the day, and particularly, after you've either been in the lab or in classes, you really don't want to do too much afterwards. I just want to lay back and relax. So this talk is actually going to be a little more relaxing than probably some others. It's not going to be data intensive. It's really talking about the program and what we're doing and where we're doing it and what we're supporting. So there's very little, if minimal data, and actually the data that's been in here isn't even mine. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what's going on. And for those of you who are interested, there's actually a really large groundswell of work with Native Americans here in St. Louis. Here, even at WashU, you've got the Catherine Buder Center for American Indian Studies, who's been here for over 30 years, and many of you don't even know about it, which is amazing. People at WashU don't even know that they exist. And there's an annual powwow. Most people don't know about that either. So I'm going to tell you stuff that we're doing, some of the stuff in the States, here in Missouri and outside. But I first want to start with figuring out how to get this to go.
Might need to just click on the presentation on the computer.
That's what I'm doing.
Click there.
Okay. So I want to start out with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the St. Louis Zoo is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Osage Nation and the Illini Confederacy. We also acknowledge that this area and parts of Missouri have been traditionally used by others, including the Pawnee, Sac and Fox, Dakota, Lakota, Oto, Missouri, Omaha, Iowa, Quapaw, Chickasaw, Kickapoo, and the Haudenosaunee. The process of knowing and acknowledging the ground beneath our feet is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the people on this land before us. It familiarizes visitors with the cultures and histories of Missouri's indigenous tribes, as well as with their ties in the St. Louis region. We honor our heritage of Native peoples and what they teach us about stewardship of the earth. So when we start thinking about indigenous cultures, and particularly here in North America, we really need to think about broader timeframes. We have a tendency to think about, what am I doing now? When am I graduating? What am I going to do after I graduate? When we start thinking about particularly indigenous cultures, it's much more a broader time frame. So like within Haudenosaunee teaching, we're a part of everything that is beneath us, above us, and around us. Our past is our present is our future, and our future is 7 generations past and present. That 7 generations is a very common theme. The decisions you make, how does that affect 7 generations in the future? Or for example, amongst the Lakota, the decisions you make this year are dependent upon the last 3 generations and their decisions or mistakes that they made and how that's going to affect the next 3 generations. Also, a lot of the focus of this program initially has been on food. And when we talk often about conservation, oftentimes, either within the zoo and aquarium community, or oftentimes, conservation biologists, they don't think about the human component. And this Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators Initiative is really focused on that intersection. So as Winona LaDuke has said, the recovery of people is tied to recovery of food, since food itself is medicine, not only for the body, but also for the soul and the spiritual connection to history, ancestors, and the land. And the reason we want to think about food is because of the disparities. If you've ever been to a reservation or worked with Native Americans, there are a number of health issues due to our stealing of their land, our forcing commodity crops on them and commodity foods. You have very high incidences of diabetes and obesity on Native American reservations, and a major lack of food. So when you look at what are defined as food deserts, for example, USDA defines a food desert in an urban setting is if you have to travel a mile to a grocery store with produce. In a rural setting, 10 miles. In many of these areas, it's much farther than 10 miles, or there may only be one food resource and it may be a convenience store on the reservation. So allowing people often to grow their own food, that aspect of food sovereignty and security is very important. That indigenous food, which will bring both health, but also that sense of connection to their culture and tradition and their relatives. So with that, several years ago, we started this initiative called Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators, and it's really focused on that intersection of wild and cultivated foods, cultural traditions, food sovereignty, healthy environments and people, and the environment as everything represented as pollinators or connected to. This is politically one thing I do at the zoo. I connected to pollinators because I'm a curator of invertebrates, director for the Center for Native Pollinator Conservation. So if upper management says, well, why are you doing this? I have to put that pollinator connection. Luckily, as many of you may know, you can connect pollinators to anything. So, and I do, and you will find that they're connected to in some ways which people may not have thought about. This is a good illustration of showing that interconnection. So that relationship between food, of course, is dependent upon nature, the pollinators. Food is also part of culture, the sovereignty and traditions. Food is related to health. Nature is related to health. Nature is related to culture. All of these things are interconnected. And that's what it's really emphasizing, this whole program, is those interconnections, those relationships. And as I said, it's about feeding those 7 generations. So whether that is your crops that you're growing, or also the wild resources too. So we also focus on those aspects too, that aspect of restoration, bringing back those traditional wild type foods, whether they be, our wild mammals like bison, elk, etc., or something that you may not even think about as food like common milkweed. And I'll mention that in a moment. We also have to remember too that how indigenous cultures deal with food is very different than the way we are doing agriculture now, particularly in a sort of a Western conventional industrial way. So Robin Walt Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, she's a professor of forestry at SUNY, who is also Citizen Potawatomi. And if you've never read this book, I highly recommend it as a way to understand a connection between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. And she says that indigenous agriculture, the practice is to modify the plants to fit the land. And that's why I used to have thousands of variety of corn. But in modern agriculture, we modify the land to fit the plants. So yellow dent #2 corn is the predominant corn we grow across the United States. Whether it's going to do well in Arizona or Maine, we're going to grow it there. So if we have to hammer the land to deal with it, we have to put in additional resources of fertilizer, water, etc. We're not allowing the land to tell us what grows best. This is also kind of the theme when I talk to people about planting native plants. Your yard, your garden will tell you if those plants belong there or if the plant wants to be there. So I always tell people experiment. And if that plant moves, it's because it wanted to be somewhere else, not in that particular location. Additionally, when we look at the traditional foods versus what we've done now to make them either sweeter or uniform in shape and size, we've lost a lot of nutrition. So this is just a simple comparison looking at, for example, Navajo blue corn to white corn. and you start looking at, various phytonutrients, they're drastically less. The corn that we buy is predominantly just starch and sugar, not too much else. Even things like blueberries, which people regard as superfoods, high in antioxidants. If you look at things like chokeberries, they are far higher in antioxidants than even our blueberries. Blueberries are healthy, but we've also modified them to fit whatever growing seasons. So sometimes those wild types are far better. Winona LaDuke has also said, food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots. This is how we consider food. Food has a culture, it has a history, it has a story, it has relationships. And this is also what we're trying to do too, bring back those relationships and those stories, because many of the people have forgotten them. And I'll mention a couple as we go along, but I will tend to go into a community and think, well, this is your food, you should know how to deal with it. It's like, no, we've been eating fried bread or something else for so long, we don't know what to do with this kind of food crop. And that's what we're also trying to bring back to those cultural traditions and even how to prepare them and store them. So I just want to go through a few wild types of food and a few domestics. And I do this in part because I'm kind of a bee guy. So I like to show a lot of bee pictures and show how that diversity of bees is also incredibly important for that diversity of wild types of plants. And many of these are either traditional medicines or food or spices. Things like bee balm, also Oswego tea. If any of you are Earl Grey tea drinkers, that lemony sort of aspect is due to bee balm or Monarda. But here you can see bumblebees, large carpenter bees, and small resin bees. Purple poppy mel, the roots are edible. Here you've got Triapiolus on the left and Seratina, small carpenter bee on the right. Bush morning glory, manroot, man of the earth root, wild potato vine. Here you got Melatomatorium, a specialist on sweet potato vine and its relatives like morning glory. Spring beauty, prairie spud. If you have never experienced this, a great place in the spring, right across from the zoo's administration building in Forest Park, it will be a blooming field of spring beauty. It is a spring ephemeral, but there are some bees which are specialists. The bee on the bottom right, Andrena aerogenei, is a specialist on spring beauty. And the root, the tuber, is also edible and traditionally used. Prairie parsley or biscuit root, some of the smaller bees, like mask bees and small sweat bees. Lead plant, downy indigo bush, tea plant, Indian shoestring. Here you can see a small sweat bee and leafcutter bee. Common milkweed. Now, some of us don't think about milkweed as a food unless we work with monarchs. So if you work with monarch butterflies, know anything? Yes, that is the food for the caterpillars. But it is also a traditional food, not across all of Indian country, but many cultures. So, for example, when I mentioned this to a friend who I'll show a picture of on Pine Ridge of the Oglala Lakota, and he mentioned milkweed as a food, and he's like, that's kind of weird. But with the Ho-Chunk of the Omaha, they would use those top 2 to 4 leaves, young leaves of a plant, and use that for greens in a soup. So with the Ho-Chunk, it's called mahench, the soup. And just as we would put in kale or spinach or whatever, it adds that nutrition. Interestingly, when I mentioned that milkweed is toxic, and common milkweed is the least toxic of them, but I mentioned that to the vice chair of the tribal council, he goes, don't know anything about toxicity, this is just food. But if we also think about the foods we eat, if anybody likes hot peppers, that's kind of a toxin, trying to keep you from eating it too. Chokeberry, you can see small sweat bees, large carpenter bees, and numerous andrenids. Serviceberry, shadberry, shadbush, juneberry, one of my favorites. If you've got a place to plant some of this stuff, great. The birds love it. If you can get the fruits before the birds, even better for you. But this is a good one that blooms throughout the day. So bees and flies during the day and moths during the night. Blueberry, cranberry, huckleberry, the whole genus Vaccinium, require buzz pollination, bumblebees, blue orchard mason bees, andrenas, and then the species on the right is the southeastern blueberry bee. 90 to 95% of its diet is just blueberry pollen and nectar. I photographed that bee at the botanical garden, I guess about 5 years ago. It had not been seen in this area since the 1930s. My speculation is it might be coming back because if you look at every spring, you go to Whole Foods or any place else, they're selling blueberries. So it's probably allowing, particularly since it's a southeastern species, it's probably allowing that bee to expand its range again. Jerusalem artichoke, sunchoke, annual sunflower. If you've never had a Jerusalem artichoke, it's the tuber, it's the root, which is the edible portion. I recommend don't eat a lot of it because it has a chemical called inulin, which will cleanse the system. But you can cook them, eat them like a potato, fry them like potato chips, or eat them raw. And of course, sunflowers, we're all familiar with them. And many specialist bees, sunflower bee in the top right, Sastra, or the female male longhorn sunflower bees. Crab apples, choke cherries, wild cherries, black cherries, wild plum, American plum, hog plum, wild goose plum, Chickasaw plum. All of these great plants for bees, great plants that are also supporting a number of species of Lepidoptera too, but also that food is both a traditional resource, but then it's also good for wildlife as well as ourselves. And then we start looking at more domestic varieties, tomatillo and ground cherry. Has anyone ever had a ground cherry here? Interesting, isn't it? To me, it's kind of like a combination of a tomato mixed with like a little bit of pineapple and mango. It's this incredible fruit. And ground cherries are native to the United States. Tomatillos are not, but this bee, the picture on the top right and bottom left, is Calides latetarsus, which is a specialist on Phasalis, which is a tomatillo. So it traditionally would have used ground cherries, but if you plant tomatillo, you may also get these bees too. And then, of course, the cultivated varieties, tomatoes of various types, bumblebees, the predominant pollinator. And then the three sisters, pumpkins and squashes, with the squash bees on the right, both Peponapus pruinosa, which some people are regarding as Melisodes. I'm still used to Peponapus, and Xenoglossa strenua. Beans of various types, whether bumblebees or two-spotted longhorns or smaller sweat bees. And then corn too. We don't tend to think about corn requiring bees for pollination, which they don't because it's wind pollinated, but bees do collect corn pollen. Honeybees will collect corn pollen when it's in bloom, but a lot of our native bees, I've seen two-spotted longhorns, bumblebees, honeybees, green metallic sweat bees, a variety of different species collecting corn pollen. So this is one where I talk about how we manage corn can affect our pollinators. Not that we need pollinators for corn, but also how we manage that resource. So when working with these indigenous communities, we do two things. One is I do not go in saying you should do this because everyone is different. I go in as representing the St. Louis Zoo and the Center for Native Pollinator Conservation. These are the services that we can offer, whether it be supplying seeds, trees, outreach, equipment, whatever it might be, whatever your needs are, because they're going to tell you what their needs are. But we also want to be responsible to the culture. And when you're looking at here in the United States, approximately 573 federally registered tribes here in the United States. There are many other state recognized tribes. And then of course you can deal with First Nations in Canada too. These are all different cultures. Their languages are different, their cultures are different, foods vary. So trying to find a way to go across that kind of pan-Indian aspect, what I've started using, the way I think, and to me, I think this is a way that we all should be thinking, is looking at what's called the 4 R's of indigeneity. And this was really originally published in a paper by LaDonna Harris, who's Comanche. She's dealt with a lot of social issues for Native Americans, as well as underserved communities. Her husband was a former US Senator, so had good connections to a lot of high-level individuals. But those 4 R's of indigeneity, I think, are a really good way of thinking about how we can relate to the animals, the plants, the people, and the environment. And those are relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. And I'll go through each one with an example. So relationship, and this is a very common idea amongst indigenous cultures, that we are all related, we are connected. The Lakota phrase, Mitakuye Yasin, we are all related, is that essence that whether you are a tree, a rock, a bee, a buffalo, whatever, we are all related as well as to your community too. So because of that, there's a societal task. So we're related to each other, and then we want to make sure that everyone feels included, feels they can make a contribution to our common good. And I use particular examples to kind of emphasize that relationship. And I think for me, one of the best examples is this bee, the squash bee, Paphnapis mellisodes pruinosa. And of course, it doesn't work properly here. But anyway, sort of. So when squashes were first cultivated around 10,000 years ago in Mexico, the bee found the domestic varieties just as good as the wild type. And as squash cultivation moved throughout North America with indigenous agriculture, the bee has actually moved with it. Right now, it is the only pollinator we know of that's actually moved with agriculture. Where we take honeybees to agriculture, this bee is moved with it. So to me, it's that intimate relationship between the food, the squash, the people who are growing that, and the pollinator, the squash bee. This is a really cool bee. If you grow squashes, they will come. Every time I've grown squashes at our house, we used to live in Dogtown, and now we live in Lindenwood Park, and I have no idea where the nearest patch of squashes are because they are specialists on squashes and cucurbits. They show up. Easy way to know if you have them too. And the reason they're also better pollinators than, say, some of the other species, first off, the pollen is much larger than a lot of other plant species, so the bee is really adapted for it. But if you know anything about squashes, they bloom before the sun rises and then often close up before noon. Honeybees are just getting active, really kind of about that time. But squash bees are active before sunrise and then also finish up most of their work by late morning. But the males sleep in the blossoms. So you can tell if you've got them, if you gently grasp one of the flowers, and if it buzzes, those are the males trying to sleep in the blossom. Because in the morning when they open up, the female shows up, everything gets pollinated, female keeps continuing to work, and the males go back to sleep. So some people think this is a really great lifestyle. That's up to you to decide. Rob Walkimmer again, it's not just land that is broken, but more importantly, our relationship to the land. So land is also an important aspect because this is where everything starts, whether you're looking at food, whether you're looking at your ancestors, elders, everything is connected to the land. The second, our responsibility, community obligation. We have a responsibility to care for all of our relatives. And we need to think about responsibility, sometimes in a much broader context. We often think about, I'm responsible for my kids, parents, et cetera. But for example, rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, used to be one of the most common bumblebees in the eastern US. Now it's on the endangered species list. We have a responsibility, in part because we are the cause of its endangerment, that we are responsible now for its care, for preserving it, preserving the land to support that bee. So we have that responsibility to other species. The third are reciprocity, the cyclical obligation underscores the fact that in nature things are circular. We often think of reciprocity, and particularly now with the Christmas season coming up, you're giving a gift to someone, you're getting a gift right back. And for some people, they feel affronted if they don't get something in return. But when we start thinking in a sense of nature, we need to think on a much longer time scale. So bumblebees to me are also a good example too. So the only thing a bumblebee can get from a tomato blossom is pollen. So what we need to do is plant nectar plants to support the rest of its diet. And then through her actions, it's giving us part of its diet. So at any one time, it may not be, that immediately give and take. It is in a longer time frame. And that's what we need to think about for reciprocity. It is much longer than just that immediacy. Each person, human or no, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relationship. Just as all beings have a duty to me, I have a duty to them. If an animal gives its life to feed me, I am in turn bound to support its life. If I receive a stream's gift of pure water, when I am responsible then I'm responsible for returning a gift in kind. An integral part of a human's education is to know those duties and how to perform them. So as I mentioned, at any given time, it's not that immediately. And I tell people too, because I give a lot of talks on, growing native plants, et cetera. And even things like people say, oh, I don't have a lot of land to do this. People do tomatoes in containers. You can do some nectar plants in containers right next to it. I've done that with no problem and get good yields of tomatoes. The other one I really like to emphasize, that aspect of that longer time frame, is the life cycle of a bumblebee. And some of you are very familiar with this, but honeybees, they'll live for several years. The lifespan has really been shortened up lately, but you only have an annual cycle for a bumblebee queen. So right now, those queens are hibernating. When they emerge in the spring, if there's nothing blooming in the spring, they cannot start their colonies. Then, of course, during the summer, to maintain the colonies, and into the fall, when those new queens are produced after they're bred, they need resources to store up. Think about a bear going into a winter sleep or hibernation. They've got to store up those resources. So things like goldenrod, blazing stars, asters in the fall. So when you start thinking of reciprocity and you think about seasons, you think about spring, summer, and fall. When we're thinking of supporting pollinators as well as agriculture, people, et cetera, it's more than just one season. Living by the precepts of the honorable harvest, to take only what is given, to use it well, to be grateful for the gift, and to reciprocate that gift. So that is also another indigenous teaching. A simple way to think about this for the honorable harvest is, if you are collecting, and this goes for bee sampling or any sort of biological sampling as well as food collection, you should really never take the first and never take the last, because then you have this idea that there's always going to be perpetually animals or plants or whatever it might be left there. So, and also it allows for the next person or community members to participate. The fourth are redistribution, the sharing obligation. Its primary purpose is to balance and rebalance relationships. And probably the best example of that is land use. So the illustration on the top would represent kind of a traditional farm. So for me growing up, visiting my great uncles in Wisconsin and Northern Illinois, they would have a farm like this. So like my Uncle Hjalmar, he would have dairy cattle, he'd have tobacco, he'd have corn, he'd have a whole variety. Now, if you go through like Iowa, you see 1,000 acres of corn, 1,000 acres of soy, nothing else. We need to figure out how we can redistribute that land, how we can create those connections, also how we create habitat for all these other species, how we use the land. It's that aspect of redistribution. Do we need it all? We need it to share with both other humans, but also with all the rest of biodiversity on this planet. One of the best and easiest examples is also monarchs too, because monarch's an easy one. Set aside a little bit of land or a pot to put in either nectar plants or particularly milkweed, because they've got that long distribution going from Mexico all the way up to Canada. So we can all be part of that redistribution of land. And also when you look at the modeling, where we're estimating that we need upwards of about 1.6 billion stems of milkweed in order to maintain a sustainable population, we all got to be planting milkweed. So with that kind of groundwork, I want to talk about what are the projects that we're doing within Indian country. And I love this sign. It's the only place I've seen that sign. This is on the Winnebago reservation up in Nebraska, but you're now entering Native America. You can actually put this sign all around the United States because it is all Native America. These circles show areas and locations where we have either been doing projects, whether it could be education outreach, supplying seeds, but all those circles are different tribes and groups that we're working with. And I'm going to go through a number of those to give you an idea of what we've been doing. Where we started first was with the Ho-Chunk Winnebago in Nebraska. And this all started very organically. Oftentimes we get into projects because, oh, I want to do this or I want to do that. For me, I had no plans of doing any of this. My wife and I visited Glacier National Park for the first time in, I think it was 2012. And for some unknown reason, I felt I had to learn about Native Americans. I have no idea why, The only Native American I met with was a police officer on the Blackfeet Nation who stopped me for speeding, gave me warning. But I just felt like I had to start reading, I had to start doing something. And for those of you who know me or don't know me, I can be somewhat obsessive about things. So my wife was like, great, just another obsession. So I'm just collecting books, reading books, etc. And then we had a meeting in Washington, D.C., hosted between the Honeybee Health Coalition and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, predominantly focused on managed pollinator protection plans. And in the White House Pollinator Health Strategy of 2015, it was defined that every state and every tribe had to develop a pollinator protection plan. And what that means as a minimum is pesticide exposure to honeybees. I gave a talk on native bees, and many of the tribes that were represented there, they thought that was great. And for the most part, they said, we don't really care about honeybees because they're not native. We care about our native bees. So I offered my services if you want to help develop a plan. And that's actually how it started, to help you write up something. The Winnebago were the first ones to invite me in. And over the next, several months to a year, we were able to get some land set aside, about a 5-acre project that wasn't being used by the tribe. I was able to get a large donation of corn, beans, and squash heirloom seeds from Seed Saver Exchange and Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds down in Mansfield, Missouri. Seed Savers is up in Decorah, Iowa. And as far as I know, we were the largest recipient of any seeds from them. Interesting thing is how they calculated how many seeds I needed, because I said, I've got about 5 acres. So I got, I think it was 62 pounds of seeds from Seed Saver, and I think 15 pounds from Baker Creek. So I'm not sure what their seeding rates they were thinking about, but we had enough that we shared with the Omaha, and we also shared with the Ponca also too. We were able to get some, I also received a donation of milkweed from Monarch Watch, and we had one of the elders seed this area. We had the kids planting milkweed, and we even had the Winnebago Parks and Wildlife digging holes to plant a lot of native trees. Initially, I started doing that. I'm getting older, and if you try to dig, 140 some holes to plant trees, it gets tiresome. Luckily, had some nice younger individuals who also brought an auger, and it made life a lot easier. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs even watered them. Unfortunately, the Bureau of Indian Affairs eventually mowed them all down. So that has to be redone. And for those of you who work in Indian country, BIA, there are some issues. There were a lot of good signs, and this is also very important too. Double rainbow over the site. When I met with one of the elders, 2 bald eagles flew over side by side. I'd never seen that before. I've still never seen that before. And they regarded that as a very good sign for the relationship and the project. We also want to make sure that the culture is identified. We work with them as we do signage and graphics. Everything is going to be written in the language of the people as well as in English. So this was one we put together. So Waiganapshina is thank you in Ho-Chunk, but we wanted also other members of the tribe on the reservation to know what was going on too. And we also wanted to make sure it has that pattern of the culture. So the borders are very representative of an applique style within the Ho-Chunk Winnebago, but most of them are tied to a particular clan. So we actually had to design one which was not tied to a clan, so it didn't have a particular relationship to anyone. So it was kind of uniform across the reservation. We also discovered that there was an old apple orchard. No one knows when it was actually grown. There used to be an apple processing facility, which is now closed down. We want to rebuild one of that. But one thing I was kind of curious about, what kind of bees are there? I saw a lot of holes of andrenids. The first time I was there, it was off season, so you really didn't see much. So what we did, we put up some bee hotels. We also identified them too. We got Winnebago Parks and Wildlife staff, and forget that creepy picture of me kind of looking weird, kind of just me. I don't know how that came out, but we put those around the orchard. and strategic locations. So the stars indicate the locations of those original bee hotels. And what I was particularly looking for were blue orchard mason bees, Osmia lignaria. So the 3 yellow stars were those nests that had Osmia lignaria nesting in them, which then we're using as a way to identify locations to add additional floral resources and additional nesting resources. Because sort of anecdotally, those trees nearest those locations also the heaviest fruit set too. One thing we need to do is actually kind of find out what those fruits are, because we have no idea what if this could be a rare heirloom variety or several heirloom varieties of apples. I know that Cornell has a repository of like 300 different varieties of apples. So need to contact them, see if there's a way that we can try and figure out what those are. I've also been lucky enough for the last few years to have students from the Buddha Center. There's Eric Pinto, who actually now works for the Buddha Center. We put up some larger bee hotels for additional nesting resources and also protecting them from possible birds too. The one thing we actually did get, weirdly enough, I've never had this before, was ant invasion in some of these nests. And very atypical, at least from my point of view. I don't know ants that well, but they brought all the resources up. So they brought the soil up into these elevated nests and packed them full of mud, and they created a nest in these tubes. It was very strange. So I'm not sure what species of ant it is, but they just kind of took it over so the bees couldn't use it at all. The Ho-Chunk were very thankful to us. They opened up a farmer's market for people because we've supplied them with a lot of seeds. Now a lot of people are growing, but it's also a place to have education programs. I've done some classes there. But through Ho-Chunk Farms and their Community Development Corporation, they honored my wife and myself with a star quilt. A star quilt is now what would have historically been a buffalo robe. So as an honor to us. So this is all hand-stitched quilt. They even incorporated the squash bee and medicine wheel logo in the center of it, and wrapped my wife in it, played us an honor song. That's where it gets emotional. We were just in tears, because we got these really cool jackets, which we still love. We wear them all the time, but we certainly were not expecting the star quilt as a thank you. And as I said, a lot of this became very organic. So the Winnebago is just north of the Omaha Reservation. So they introduced us to the Omaha and Nebraska Indian Community College. Nebraska Indian Community College represents the Omaha and the Santee Sioux. So we got another donation of milkweed for Monarch Watch, and they have 2 prairie restoration projects at NICC on their 2 campuses. So we started planting those. I also supplied them with a lot of heirloom seeds. A lot of the traditional varieties for some of the tribes have disappeared. So white corn is very important for many of the cultures, particularly the Omaha and the Winnebago. They make a traditional white corn soup, but particularly for ceremony, whether it be for funerals or other ceremonies, the white corn is very important for that soup. So we supplied them with an heirloom variety of corn. And I just love this picture. First off, they made all these little plots, and this one family, this is just the size of the corn. I've never grown corn that big in my backyard. And then the ear of corn is like almost as large as the child is. So now it's to the point where with the Ho-Chunk Winnebago, I don't have to supply them with corn anymore. They've saved enough seeds. They're growing their own corn. So they have now started to bring back their corn and kind of letting it adapt to their land. We've held classes on bee biology and bee hotels with local gardeners and with elders on the Omaha Reservation. And the newest project with the Omaha is Harvesting Hope in the Medicine Pollinator Garden. The Omaha Nation Public School started this project last year, where this large area next to their football stadium, they planted in traditional crops as well as fruit trees. And we're actually going to be putting in more fruit trees, more native plants. And the idea was to give kids some economic development, but also teach them about food and teach them the stories and the language. So elders are part of this in teaching the language and the stories of the food. So it's really revitalizing these kids, and they've really gotten into it. And there's a really great video on YouTube on Harvesting Hope. And if you email me, I can send you the link to it. I'm not in the video, I get a little acknowledgement at the end, but it is just such an incredible experience to see these kids growing these foods and developing this project. And the medicine wheel garden was put in as a way to, and medicine wheel, if you're unfamiliar with it, represents many things. It can represent the colors of all the people of the earth. It represents the 4 main directions. It represents the seasons. It has a lot of cultural significance, particularly to Northern Plains tribes. So I came up with this idea, well, why don't we do a medicine wheel garden where each of the quadrants is planted with more or less the colors of that quadrant. And now put together this really nice one. So this will also add for a lot of additional pollinators for that garden area for Harvesting Hope. We also produced a simple 2-page bee guide, started with Missouri, then I changed the wording a little bit to common bees, but we then offered it to anyone who wanted to use it. So we just allow them to, put their logo on it. We've used it for the Oblada Lakota, with the Quapaw, with Keweenaw Bay, with the Meskwaki, Second Fox in Mississippi, and Center for Rural Affairs in Omaha. And it's just a simple resource. So a lot of these things don't take necessarily a lot of time and money. It's just acknowledging and helping people do what they want to do. We've done education outreach programs with Pawnee Nation College, and now we're doing even more, and I'll mention in a moment. On Pine Ridge, and as I said, all of this grows organically. So I got connected with Pine Ridge due to one of our Conservation Council members at the zoo, who was friends to an advisor from the Booter Center, who introduced me to graduates from the Booter Center who worked at Pine Ridge, who then told me about Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. Then I contacted their director of food sovereignty, and he just happened to be in Washington, D.C. for a meeting the same time I was. So we got to meet. I eventually went up to Pine Ridge to meet with them, and we started supporting Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. He has now started his own organization, Makoche Agriculture Development. This is Nick Hernandez. This is a greenhouse we supplied to him, and he is working now across all of Pine Ridge to really kind of focus on food security, food sovereignty, everything from regenerative chicken production to we're going to be starting to work on habitat restoration, hopefully bison up there too, but a whole variety of things. And Nick is one of those incredible people. He's a go-getter. He just got a $2.5 million USDA grant to assist with his programs. Now, we've also been working, to me, one of my favorite places with the Confederate Station Kootenai Tribe of the Flathead Nation in Western Montana. And I was just up there in September, and it's always nice to find some place where it's really nice to work. It's beautiful. I always tell people, if you're working on a dissertation project, if you can get an animal that you're working with that could potentially kill you or something, gives you a little more excitement, or find some place where you really want to go. Not necessarily do something in your own backyard, which can be cool, but if you can travel, even better. So we started working with the CSKT, and their goal was not issues of food. They wanted to focus on pollinators. So we got a grant through St. Louis Zoo to start doing some pollinator restoration in Mission Valley. This is actually an overlook to Mission Valley. So we're actually going to be putting up graphics, which will be in Salish and Kootenai, as well as in English to talk about the project. But this will also be for anyone just going through the reservation to see some of these issues and projects. We also modified the bee guide. So it's specifically for the Mission Valley. I changed some of the bees around, and it also has the Salish and Kansa Kootenai names for bee on there too, which is the first time we've done that in having the language of the people. We're also going to be working with them with wildlife crossings. If any of you know anything about wildlife crossings or work with them, Flathead Nation probably has the most wildlife crossings and underpasses per mile than any place else in the US. They have an incredible wildlife department through the tribe. And this is the first one that you go, the Animals Bridge. It's great for wolves, bears, moose, and elk, but we want to make sure it's also beneficial for pollinators too. So we want to do a little bit of replanting, so it's a connection for pollinators. And now the CSKT has taken over what used to be called the National Bison Range. They just took it over this past January, became official, which makes a lot of sense. The land was taken away from them to put in this bison range. Their bison weren't bought by the US government. They were sold someplace else. So the US government, because they don't want to buy them, so then they had to buy them from somewhere else to restock this land, which already had the bison historically that had been saved by people of the Salish people. It's really bizarre. But then, because of their commitment to the land and also the traditions with the animals too, they felt that we should be, taking this. This is what happens, unfortunately, with a lot across Indian country. There's still a lot of racism and a lot of issues, people not thinking that they could manage them, et cetera. But finally, through a lot of negotiations, they just took it over this past June. They redid the interpreter center, so their focus is on the tribals system. So we're going to be working with them on putting in a number of pathways that will also focus on pollinator plant relationships and also the relationships of bison to bees too. So kind of broaden that whole experience and story. Here in St. Louis, we're working with a project called Coahoma Orchard in the Greater Ville area. This is stewarded by a woman who is African Mississippi Choctaw. She wants to increase food security in the Greater Ville area, but then also bring back the culture and tradition of the people of that area too. It's amazing. There are a lot of Native Americans here in St. Louis. You just maybe don't know about them, but also from Coahoma County in Mississippi and individuals of Mississippi Choctaw. Their diaspora, many of them came to the St. Louis area. We also work with the Kansas City Indian Center, supporting them with equipment, seeds, supplies. They've got a new director, Ed Smith, there. He's actually since moved here to St. Louis. So I hope to meet with their new director of food security and start developing additional projects with them. And then the coolest part, and this is where I said I can connect bees to anything. As I've been a mammal curator, and actually my dissertation was on antelope, not bees. All the bee stuff is self-taught, and that's how I tell people, if I can learn bees, you guys can learn bees too. So what we're looking at doing are these bison pollinator pastures. Bison graze differently than cattle. They feed predominantly on grasses and sedges, whereas cattle will also feed on a lot of forbs. So a paper that was just published within the last 6 months showed that bison grazing actually increased overall forb diversity by 86%, far higher than cattle do. So cattle are not necessarily a surrogate, but bison are also culturally important, from a faith-based system to their aspect of relationship to also that idea of land. And as you can see here, this is actually on the bison range. You can see all these wildflowers, bison not bothering them. So we're going to start redoing some of the bison pastures in the Omaha Nation. We got $10,000 to start reseeding this in native forbs, grasses, and sedges. Because if you work with groups like USDA, NRCS, they will give you a bison mix, but half of it is exotics. It's like, why? These are bison. They grew up with these plants. Why do we have to put in European fescue and other things too, when it's going to be much more supportive? The Winnebago are adding 2 additional bison pastures too, so we'll be able to get in the ground floor of also reseeding those. And then, as sort of a corollary to all of this, the American Prairie Reserve, if you're not familiar with it, is the largest rewilding project in North America. It is in northeastern Montana. The goal is to reconnect public and private lands to create a landscape as it would have appeared to Lewis and Clark when they went in there around 1805, 1804. So their goal is 3.2 to 3.5 million acres, connecting things like the Charles Russell Wildlife Refuge, the Missouri Breaks with public lands, eventually having 10,000 bison free roaming, 25,000 elk, pronghorn, et cetera. But there are some USDA ARS researchers right now looking at bison and bee diversity, and also the effect of bison wallows, which is also something that cattle don't do for ground nesting bees. So we're supplying them with some of the equipment, and also my wife and I just love the American Prairie Reserve. We were there September before last, and it's just incredible. And if you've never been there, and one thing, if you go during the elk rut. It is the most bizarre thing possible. So the Charles Russell, September, the elk are in rut. It is like a sporting event. So everybody shows up, there's a sign that says elk viewing here. So people drive up in their cars and pickups, pull out their lawn chairs and sit. The elk come out of the forest, hundreds of them. The males are roaring, the females are squealing. There's fighting going on. Sometimes someone may die, but there's all this, and people are just watching this. And then as the sun sets, all the elk disperse again and people go home. It is one of the most, I've never experienced anything like this as a wildlife spectacle. So if you like wildlife spectacles, check it out. And there is this idea that, doing these aspects of forbs with bison could be just, for a bee benefit, for our own benefit. But as Makhlon Najin says, the buffalo like to wallow their big heads in the sunflowers, and many times saw them with long stems wound about the left horn, for they never wore them on the right horn. Perhaps they did this to decorate themselves, or maybe they liked the smell of the flowers. We only knew that they liked the sunflower. And then the final couple of projects we're just starting. We're working now with the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, which is right where Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska come together. They have established a new tribal national park, former TNC land, Nature Conservancy, pristine prairie. We want to reconnect that with corridors. They want to do biodiversity surveys. And this is also the one thing too, for anyone who's interested in working on reservations, particularly doing biological sampling. A lot of it depends upon the tribe. So for example, with the Flathead Nation, you're not killing any bees. So it's all straight observation. The Meskwaki were like, yeah, if that's what you want to do. But you also have to be cognizant of the culture and their belief system too, and what you're going to do. And here with the Iowa, they want to do more pollinator work, some cultural gardens, but then also really understand and how to develop this Iowa Tribal National Park. And then the final thing, as I said, we started working with Nebraska Community College and Pawnee Nation College for a variety of things, but we also started working with the Rise Veteran Foundation, and they are a Native American veterans organization dealing with everything from PTSD to drug addiction to entrepreneurship. We worked together to get a USDA grant called We Are All Related, and the idea was to educate individuals on reservations and others off about traditional, regenerative, and indigenous agriculture. The idea being that bring back that culture, bring back that aspect of food security, but also bring back the possibility of entrepreneurship. So we are now leveraging that into other programs. And what we're doing now, there is a former U.S. Forest Service Job Corps site in Golconda, Illinois, which is in southeastern Illinois. It's about 269 acres or so. And the Forest Service gave it up in 2017. We are taking that over to create a Native American veterans site to deal with medical issues and entrepreneurship and training, but also a tribal college. This will be the first tribal college east of the Mississippi. Right next to it is San Damiano Catholic Retreat. They have also given that up. So that's an additional, I think, 200 acres. That will be for women housing, and the other will be for men. There's a full medical facilities. We're going to work with everything from agriculture to carpentry to whatever. We also are developing a relationship with University of Illinois Ag Extension. They've got 5,000 acres that we can bring students to for greenhouse production or for forestry. And then Shawnee National Forest is also interested in joining with us and looking at habitat restoration. So now we're dreaming big. It's like, well, maybe we can start reintroducing bison and elk in southern Illinois. So this project has gotten so big, and some of the aspects we're talking about, including trafficked individuals. Native Americans are the highest group of trafficked individuals. We met with two women, one of our last meetings there. One is Navajo Dene, the other was Cherokee. They deal with 40 to 70 trafficked individuals per month. And in the state of Illinois, there are only 30 dedicated trauma beds for trafficked individuals. We will literally double or triple the amount of beds for the state, but we will also have facilities for medical therapy and also vocational training, et cetera, because if these individuals are also given a job opportunity, 95% of them do not go back to their handlers and groomers. They will have their own, life and go back to their families. So this site is becoming all these things. And now we're looking at this as actually, this is the first of 3 or 4 sites across the country. It keeps getting bigger and bigger, where we represent all the different habitats and representing all the tribes across North America. So the final thought, and this is all about this, it's restoration. So we need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands, but also for our relationship to the world. We need to restore honor to the way we live so that when we walk through the world, we don't have to avert our eyes with shame, so that we can hold our heads up high and receive the respectful acknowledgement of the rest of Earth's beings. And with that, I hope you've learned a little bit more, both about the culture, but also something which you may not be aware of that's actually happening here in St. Louis and around the country. And there's a lot of opportunities for a lot of work out there in restoration, in research, in food security, in health, et cetera. And it's just working with the people and finding out what they need. And with that, I thank you.
All right, thank you, Ed. We have time for a few questions.
So we have a couple of comments from YouTube that I wanted to relay.
Sure.
Elaine Bader says, I'm a National 4-H Pollinator Ambassador and a WashU freshman. Your lecture is fascinating. Amy Joy Camp says, it's so amazing to me how they just show up and know where to go. I'm assuming this is in reference to the bees.
Yeah, I don't know how they find. I mean, the first time, as I said, the first patch I grew, I asked my wife, can I just tear out 2 square yards of our front lawn and grow some squash and some beans? And she said, fine. And that first year, I had both Xenoglossa and Pepinepas show up. I have no idea where they came from, but if you build it, they will come.
And then Emily Warshevsky at Mobot says, I'd be happy to connect you with some folks who work with apples at the USDA and in Canada.
Oh, that'd be great.
And Brittany Cordera says, what was the name of the person that owns Kohima Orchard?
Her name is Dale Chambers.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And I put my email address up here too, so in case anybody, I'll put it back up, in case anybody wants to contact me about anything.
Okay, thanks. A question that I had, I was really interested in your mention that one of the tribes you were working with was very receptive to native pollinator conservation and were kind of turned off by the focus on honeybees. I feel like that's a sentiment the general public should have, but oftentimes the general public is focused on honeybees and not native pollinators. Have you learned anything, any unique perspectives in working with the tribes that you have that might help pitches to the general public to promote native pollinator conservation and have less of a focus on honey?
I think the biggest perspective is that they care about what is here, not what has been introduced. So whether it be the plants, many of them, sacred, either foods or herbs, but being able to sometimes connect them, because like a lot of people, we don't know about bees. They talk to most people on the street. They may know honeybee, they may be able to draw a bumblebee, but pretty much they don't know anything else. But talking about that diversity and that relationship, and this is one thing we've been trying to find too, are there any bee stories? I can find spider stories, I can find dragonfly stories and butterfly stories. There's no real bee stories. So I think in part it's creating those bee stories and that connection. So one of the things, a connection that I just discovered just last year, white sage. White sage, Artemisia ludoviciana, is a sacred plant used for smudging purposes to remove bad spirits. Grows across the west and in the northern portion, but it's wind pollinates. It's all kind of pale whitish green, but I grow it at home, and the one year I'm looking at it going, something's wrong with this. There's all these, it's changing color. There's these green patches on there. It's like, what's going on? Is it needing more water? What is it? And I have a lot of bee hotels at our house, but I've never had carter bees nesting in them before. And then that year, suddenly there's carter bees. And if you can tell carter bees because it looks like somebody just shoved cotton in the hole of that bee hotel. And so I just followed the females. They were going to that white sage and scraping off the hairs, rolling it into a ball and taking that away. So now I have that additional story, that bee story with a sacred plant. And all of these, whether we're talking about corn, beans, squash, but there's a really important sacred plant that you can start connecting. And this, I think, connects the people of that tribe or nation more to those bee stories because they don't really know about it. But then it allows you to kind of bring in those stories and connect and make those, get that kind of first foot or step in the door too.
Yeah, good perspective. Thank you.
Thank you again for your talk. You began speaking about like health disparities in populations. I don't know if you have any stories, anecdotal or data in terms of like how doing this work of restoring native populations, both plant and animal, have maybe impacts on health disparities. I was also thinking about mental health disparities as well, like place attachment.
Yeah, some of the tribes are really focused on trying to get more information. So, the Ho-Chunk Winnebago, they're doing annual surveys through Ho-Chunk Farms and Ho-Chunk Inc., looking at what the health disparities are. And we're hoping that, because as we've been planting for several years and more people have been growing, we'll actually get some good data on those changes and food choices, et cetera. But as I said, one of the biggest issues is also getting people to grow it is one thing. What do you do with it next? And this is where I came in with, a cultural bias, thinking, well, squash, that's your traditional food. You should know what to do with it. And people go, I don't know what to do with this. So now our next step is to actually bring in indigenous chefs to work with people. So a friend of mine is the manager of 4 different indigenous chefs. We're planning, hopefully next year, to do a fundraiser for the Omaha Nation Public School, which will also raise money to build a processing and storage facility for all the crops that the kids are growing. But then an individual like Freddie Bitsoy, who was the executive director for the National Museum of American Indian, he would also, besides the dinner fundraiser, he would also teach classes on how to use these traditional foods. And that's, I think, one of the biggest areas we need to incorporate. And that's what we want to. Chef Nephi Craig, who the Buddha Center brought in for the Hunt Fish Gather dinner, he is actually trained to deal with these health disparities and social issues too. So we want to get him involved, working with like the culinary arts at Golconda as they're being developed, or they have a new culinary program with the Omaha Nation Public School. So right now, I think there's a lot of information on what's been bad, but I think hopefully as we're growing more and more, we're going to get to see more of these things. And with the bison in particular, expanding the number of bison on reservations so that they are able to use that as their meat source. But there again, a lot of people have lost the taste for even bison. So some of the younger kids, it's easier to get them eating bison, whereas some of the older individuals, they've been, eating beef or commodity foods and they've lost it. So it's that whole re-education of the palate too. Fry bread is a classic example. Places, and if you ever had fry bread, it's basically fried bread. It's survival food. It tastes good, whether you're putting powdered sugar and honey on it or making an Indian taco. But when you tell people, no, this is unhealthy and you're not going to serve this anymore, people get upset. They have competitions. Who's got the best fry bread? They talk about, their mother and grandmother making the best fry bread. So trying to change those. There are some research projects going on. Martin Reinhardt at Northern Michigan University did a project called Decolonizing Diet Project. He is Ojibwe, and he developed a diet, and there's a cookbook too, that you could only eat foods that were available in that area prior to around 1640 or so. So certain things like tomatoes hadn't gotten to that part of Michigan yet. And he worked with, he's published some papers on it. He worked with indigenous individuals as well as whites, and they could go on the diet for 25%, 50%, 75 or 100%. And everyone showed reduced triglyceride levels, weight loss. Sometimes it was easier for tribal members because they could hunt at all times of the year, whereas for us, there's only a particular hunting season. But there are some projects going on right now showing that. There are also, there's a conference, I think this is its 5th year, on Native American health which is focused primarily focused on food, but it covers all different aspects from historical trauma to breastfeeding to everything else. It's just an incredible conference that's held by the Shakopee Mdewakanton Nation up in Minnesota. But there's more and more of this going on. And I think for groups like ourselves, for the Center for Native Pollinator Conservation, it's just how can we fit in and how do we work with that? One of my goals is that this Native Food Initiative actually spins off as its own standalone 501c3 that can work across Indian country and actually has indigenous people running it, not some third generation European. And I think that's going to make it much more effective, even more so, even though everywhere I go, it's, they like me. Weird. It always seems weird. People like me. And it's always weird too, because they all call me Dr. Ed. And it just, Dr. Ed, it just sounds odd in some respects, but that's, it's the way they honor you too. So.
Great. Well, we are out of time. So please join us across the hall in room 309 for our reception, and join me once again in thanking Ed. All right, great talk.
Thank you.
Very interesting to hear about all of your work.
Yeah, and it just keeps, and what I tell people, I'm basically a lazy person, so I don't know how I'm doing all these things. It's like,